Hi there, my name's Pete Van Ward. I'm so glad that you joined us today. I'm the lead pastor at North River Church, and I'm excited about a new series that we are starting today. And I want to begin with a story. I have a good friend who was part of our congregation when I was serving the church in Missouri, and he was a pilot. He had opportunities to do a lot of mission trips, and so he got his pilot's license, and every now and again, he would take me on one of these trips. And I've always been enamored by flying. I thought it's such an interesting thing to get in the cockpit of a plane and take off and just see the world from that perspective. And so we had a lot of conversations about what it takes to, get into a position where you can fly your own plane. And one of the things that he talked to me about was that there is a challenge with flying. Like when everything's great and the weather is good, no worries. But when things start getting a little complicated with the weather, whether it's clouds or fog or wind, you have to be really careful with how you fly. In fact, it's so interesting. He said when the storms come and you fly into the clouds, your whole body experiences something called spatial disorientation. And the way he explained it was to say that when you are flying and you think you're going well, and you move into a position where you can't see, your body will tell you everything's fine. And the reality may be that you could be in a total nosedive and not even realize it because your body plays tricks on you. And he said, this is where the statement came from, like, you can't fly by the seat of your pants because you cannot trust your instincts when you're flying in a storm. In fact, when some of the first airmail pilots started to fly and bring deliveries of mail to the other places around the country, there were numerous crashes that came as a result of the spatial disorientation. And so they developed a training process where you had to learn how to use your instruments and trust what was on the dashboard over and above what you were feeling in your own heart. And so what you had to do is you had to move from flying by feel to flying by trust, where you had to trust what was happening on the instrument panel more than your own personal instincts. And as he was describing this, I thought this is such a great analogy for what it means to develop your spiritual life as well. So one of the challenges that I think most of us face when we're trying to grow in our understanding of who God is and what it means to follow him is that we get to this place where we too kind of tend to lean in to our own instincts, where we trust our own judgment, we trust our emotional capacity, we have a feeling that we can control our circumstances. And for the most part, when everything's going fine and everything's going well, that seems to work for us. But then the storms hit. And then all of a sudden, the things change and we realize, just like the pilot, we cannot trust our instincts. They don't serve us well when the health report comes that we were not expected, when we hit the financial crisis, when we have a relational breakdown. All of a sudden, everything inside of us starts to spin, and we don't know which way is up. And so we have to start to try and trust something else besides our own wisdom, our own understanding. Now, when it comes to faith, we not only have the challenge of knowing what to do when the storms hit, but we have another, what I would suggest, complicating factor, and that is that many of us have been to what we'll call Christian ground school. So when a pilot is in training, they can sit in a class and they can see all the instruments and they can begin to gain an understanding of what those instruments are meant to do. But it's not until you are in the air that you know what to do, right? Because you're all of a sudden like, I can know the things by heart, but unless I have the experience of using them in the storm, I'm not going to be very good at it. And I think the same thing can happen with our faith too. Like, not only do we have this pre-orientation and predisposition to trust our instincts, but sometimes we in our church ground school think we know what Christianity is all about. In other words, we can get to this place where we feel like being a Christian or following God is all about having like certain information or certain understanding of like theological concepts of what God is like, and then working really hard to try and follow those rules. Like, that's sometimes what we end up believing about our journey with the Lord. And again, it's like we're in this place where we think we know what it's going to be about until we hit the storms of life and we realize all of that information that we have and all of that quote unquote mental understanding is not going to serve us well in the midst of the storm. We need something more. Now, I think that one of the additional challenges, let's say, that we have to deal with when we are like in the church world is that many of the ways in which Christianity and growth in Christianity is described is that it's super complex and super mysterious, right? And so you get to this place where you're like trying to figure out like, what does it mean to like grow in my understanding of and my relationship with God? And if you've been around church long enough, and many of you have been, you have probably heard a whole laundry list of things that you quote unquote need to do to be in a relationship with God. But it's also a little foggy. and I get it, because there is some mystery around faith, and it is a miracle when a heart changes. But because of some of the ways that we've talked about it, you kind of find yourself saying like, well, am I reading enough of the Bible? Am I attending enough meetings? Do I use the right vocabulary when I pray? Do I have the right emotional response when I'm in a service? Am I giving enough? If I'm serving enough? And they have like all these things, and you're like, what is this really about? Well, we are in this new series where I'm going to be talking about the demystifying of transformation. I want to talk about this process of developing our journey with God, growing as Christian people in a way that makes sense. And I want to base this series on something that Paul does for us in 1 Corinthians 13. He gives us this great gift. He boils down the essence of what's most important in one verse. 1 Corinthians 13:13. Here's what he says. 3 things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And I think what Paul does is he gives us this sense in which if you want to really understand what's at the heart of the Christian faith, it's about giving attention to these 3 focal points. And my contention throughout this series is going to be, to the degree that we grow in faith, hope, and love, to that same degree will we become more like Christ. Let me say that again. To the degree that you and I can grow in these dynamics of faith, hope, and love, to that same degree, we become more like Christ. And so what I'm going to do in this series is I'm going to take a week to talk about each one of those dynamics and get right down to the brass tacks of what it means to grow in these dimensions of our life. So what does it mean to grow in faith? What does it mean to grow in hope? What does it mean to grow in love? And my suspicion is if we take this process seriously, we'll come out on the other end being people who are more like Christ, who reflect Christ in increasing ways in life, because we're more full of faith, hope, and love. I know it sounds very simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And so I want to begin at the very first step, and that's what Paul talked about in terms of faith. So we're going to step into the cockpit We're going to look at the instrument panel, and I'm going to suggest that faith is the first thing that helps hold us steady. Now, as soon as I start talking about faith, I think it's really important to begin with definitions. Like, one of the things that I think becomes a bit problematic is that we live in a culture that tends to define faith, particularly in a religious sense, in two ways that are not always helpful. So the first way is that it is often described as like a blind belief. Like, it's this, like, close your eyes, don't pay attention to the evidence, don't try and understand it, just take this leap of blind faith. You'll hear it talked about in that way. And it's basically an emotional thing. Like, you just believe in the goodness of the world and how it's going to play out, and you just put your trust in that, and it'll all kind of work together for good. So that's one way that faith is described at a very emotional level. The other way in the office is described is more intellectual, that it's like you acknowledge the existence of this thing, this person, this entity. It's like it's an intellectual agreement. In other words, you believe in God and that he exists in the same way that you believe that Australia exists. Like, it's more of a proposition, and you say, okay, this is a way to look at life, and I'm going to do my best to follow these principles, these ideas, these practices, and it will go well for me. That's what it means to have faith. And I think it's really important to like start right up front and say that when we look at Scripture, it really doesn't describe faith in either of those ways. It is not fundamentally an emotional experience. It is not fundamentally an intellectual experience. It's not blind belief. In fact, what I like to think of it in this way: faith is the calculated trust based on God's track record. So I am trusting the personality, the character of a person that I know because of how he's operated in history and how he's operated in my life. And then secondly, it's more than intellectual belief, because the scriptures even remind us that the devil believes that God exists, right? So it has to be about something more than intellectual belief. It has to do with a kind of internal trust that God exists, that he has certain character qualities, he is intimately involved with our lives, and that is what helps us live out a life that is truly connected to God and his truth. Now, I want to kind of make this more personal. Some of you have heard me share my story before. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I kind of went into detail about my own personal testimony. But in case you missed that, I just want to kind of give a quick summary of the fact that I grew up around a family that was very religious. That, you know, we were the family that we went to church pretty much every time the doors were open. We did it as a family, mom, dad, kids, everybody came. And we had family devotions every night after dinner. This was just kind of the way that I grew up. And so I was very much around belief and faith and Christianity and the ideas of Christianity throughout my growing up years. But I just never connected to it. It was not, the way I would say it, it's just not for me. Like, I was happy that my parents found some help in their faith and belief. I didn't have anything against them finding meaning in it. But for me, I was like, it's just not connecting. And really, when I went back to like thinking how they thought about it, I was like, I think it's like a philosophy of life. Like, you want to be a person who has a good philosophy of life. And so I granted them that, but it was just not mine. And my philosophy of life was, I want to do what I want to do, and I want to have some fun. And that's exactly what I did. And there were some years where that seemed to work for me. But then I started to face some consequences of poor choices. And my life, as the recovery community made famous, my life became unmanageable. And I found myself in a place where I could no longer trust my instincts. I realized that this was not going to work for me. And I came to a point where I realized I need a reference point. I need something beyond my own instincts to manage life. Because it cost me in every way it could cost me. Like the way I had been living cost me with my family. It cost me with the law. It also cost me in terms of what my future could be. And so I knew I needed a change. And I knew that I needed to start searching for something. And it was at that moment where I understood at a new level through a whole series of circumstances, which I talked about before, that God was loving, trustworthy, a person of character. Now, I just want to insert this idea because there's some of you who are listening to me. And right away, as I'm talking about this, you're thinking of somebody who may be in the same position I was. Like they grew up around faith, they understood church and all the things, but they've walked away from it. And you're as a parent or a grandparent, or even as a kid looking at their parents, you're thinking, I just don't know what's going to happen to my kids. I don't know what's going to happen to my grandpa. And you're worried about them. And so you're trying all the different ways to try and influence them or share with them. And, you just want them to come to faith. And I want to just add this. You cannot make this happen for somebody. I know that's frustrating to hear. It has to be a personal discovery. And so one of the things I tell people who are worried about friends or family is I say to them, there's two things you can do. One, pray that their eyes would be open to where they really are. Because that's what happened to me. I all of a sudden saw that it was no longer about having fun. It was no longer about doing my own thing. It was costing me. And so pray that God would give them the gift of seeing the consequences of their choices. And I know that's a hard prayer to pray because sometimes that's really painful. It ends in a really hard way. But sometimes that's the exact same thing that is required in order to move them in a new direction. And then secondly, I would say stay close enough relationally so that when the crash happens, they might turn to you for some help and support. Now, I'm not saying you can never share anything with them or you can't give them like a book or something. But just recognize this is a personal process. And so my suggestion would be that you move to a place where you understand afresh, and maybe you already get this, you just need the vocabulary for it, but that faith is at its core an immensely personal and fundamentally relational dynamic to life. And that discovery or that realization comes usually on the other end of a crisis when you realize, I can't trust myself. Just in the same way the pilot can't trust himself when he's in the storm. And may be painful to watch, may be painful to experience, but on the other end of that, we find ourselves connected to God. Now, I would suggest that even with some of that backdrop, I have been in ministry long enough to know that there are many people who I see as like in this constant wrestling match with God, even if they are not sure he exists, right? So it's like they have this internal thing that's happening where they're frustrated about God's, timing of things or God's intervention or lack thereof, or is he really good? And so they're kind of always arguing with their life and what's happening and their circumstances. And so they find themselves saying, like, I want to have faith. It's just like it's not working out for me in the ways I had hoped. And I found, and look, we all have times like that. I have times like that. But I think the heart of faith, and like if you pull back to the 30,000-foot view, the heart of faith is about like, I'm going to stop wrestling with God and thinking I know better. It's about saying, I'm going to move from my debate with God to an abiding in God. And faith at its core, in addition to everything else I've already talked about, faith at its core is a rest with a settled mind that's anchored in a personal relationship with Jesus. And when I can come to that conclusion, I find that there is a place from which to build. Now, I'm aware that some of you who've been around church, you've been in your own journey, all of this that I've been talking about is not necessarily new information. Like you've probably heard things like this before, but I want to suggest that it could be vital information. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we need to be reminded of the vitality of who God is and what he wants to be in our life. And we lose sight of it. Because the fact of the matter is, many of us, and maybe even, as you're watching today, many of us come to experiences like this with all kinds of noise, all kinds of things that are trying to grab our attention, things that are calling out to us and saying, oh, you need to pay attention to this, or what about that, or how come that's not working, right? And so we can because those things get really loud, we can find ourselves thinking, oh man, like, where does faith fit into all of that? And one of the ways that I've been thinking about faith recently is that it is the steering wheel for my soul. So one of the ways that I like to think about this is like, if I'm on this journey with God, there is this thing happening next to me where there's the circumstances of my life that are shouting at me. Like, oh, watch out for what's coming, watch out for what, turn on the brakes. That's going to hit you. Trying to get my attention to do all these, to stop moving forward. And part of what my faith does is it gives me a hold on the steering wheel to say, no, I am not paying attention to the shouting on the passenger side of my car. I am determined to take this journey with the Lord. Now, with all of that as a backdrop, I want to kind of get to the fundamental question that I've posed at the beginning of this whole service. I want to now kind of begin to address. So, okay, I get the idea of what faith is. You've been talking about it. I'm resonating with all that. But it still leaves me with the question, well, how do I grow in my faith? It's one thing to have faith, but how does faith grow in my life? How does faith become a greater dimension of my life? And what I want to propose today is to begin to adopt a biblical diagnostic of your soul. And what I mean by that is and I know it's going to sound very simplified, but just to kind of give us a frame of reference. There are things in your life that I'm going to call variables, right? So you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be dealing with things that feel shaken. And it really references back to something that the writer of Hebrews talked about. He said, when God spoke from Mount Sinai, his voice shook the earth. But now he promises, once more I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens also. This means that this means that all of creation will be shaken and removed, so that only what is unshakable will remain. Since we are receiving a kingdom that is unshakable, let us be thankful. Now, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that there are going to be variables in our life. There are going to be things in our life that will always be shaken. Now, let me move from the theoretical to the practical. You are going to have in your life a variety of variables. Let me just name a couple. Your job status and your career security. It can change with one corporate restructuring, right? It's a variable. Your bank account and your financial portfolio. It fluctuates with inflation, markets, and unexpected expenses. Your physical energy and health. A single diagnosis or just the natural passage of time changes your capacity. The culture around us, opinions, politics, social norms, they shift like the sand from one year to the next, right? So these are all the variables in our life. And if we try and put our security in those variables, our life will be as uncertain. It'll shake as much as this shakes. That's just the reality of it. And that's what so many people do. And that's why their lives seem so unstable, because they keep putting their confidence in the variables. And so the biblical diagnostic I want to propose is to shift our attention from the variables to the constants. Scripture says in Malachi 3:6, I am the Lord, I do not change. It's echoed again in Hebrews. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Well, what does that mean? It means that we can trust God on 3 levels. Number 1, his character. He is holy, he is loving, he is just, and he is present always. So we can trust his character. We can also trust his covenant, right? So we are secure in the Lord, not because we're perfect, but because Christ took our place on the cross to bear our sin and set us free. That is an everlasting covenant. And to the degree that we hold on to that covenant, we can have a place of security. So we trust his character, we trust his covenant, and then finally we trust his commitments to us. God is always about his work. And I know this can sound so cliche, but Romans 8:28 is something I have to continue coming back to, that God is always at work, turning all things to good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So the biggest challenge to my faith is to toggle between putting confidence in my variables to putting confidence in my constants. So one of the things I would suggest is just look at how you wake up in the morning. What is it that you are focused on? What is your mind dwelling upon? And I would suggest that for many of us, we wake up in the morning and we're thinking about the variables. My job, my bank account, my energy, my health, the world and what's going on in the world. Like that becomes the thing that I lean into. And it's no wonder that my confidence is shaken. Because God said all that stuff is going to be shaken. But what if I could toggle from the variable being my point of focus to the constants of God's character, God's covenant, and God's commitment? Now, I'm not suggesting you never think about the variables and that there aren't times when those can scream really loudly and they need some attention. But I am suggesting that it's not the place I go to first. And that I always have this other thing in the back of my mind, that whenever the variable is shouting for my attention, my first action is not to try and correct the circumstance. My first action is to remind myself of the constant of God. That I can trust his character. I can trust his covenant. And I can trust his commitment. And I think the life with God, the journey of God, the growth of faith is practicing that as often as I can. And we'll have seasons when we're better at it, and we'll have seasons when we're not so good at it. But it's the pursuit of that. It's like allowing the Holy Spirit to energize that in a more consistent way in my life, where I grow in faith. The friend that I was telling you about at the beginning of the talk, the pilot friend, he had a very interesting comment to me. He said, You know, a lot of people, they only rely on the instruments when the storms come. And he said, you know what? I've decided that I am going to attend to the instruments every time I fly, so that when the storms come, it won't be a new thought for me. And again, I thought that's such a great illustration, right? Like, I want to, just in the normal routines of life, find myself toggling back to the constant of God, his character, his covenant, and his commitment. And because when you give focus to something, you see it more often. It's like when I see that and I acknowledge that and I live in the context of that when the storms come, it won't be a new thing for me. Like, I will be practiced in that toggle, in that switch over into that new vision. It will be more axiomatic because I've worked at understanding it and doing it. Now, let me close with this. I'm going to invite you to make this extremely personal. So there are times, I think, when we can be like listening to something and it can connect with us, and we'll kind of put it in our back pocket and say, yeah, I'll think about that more sometime. Of course, we never do. And so I want to say, for some of you, today is like a marker day because you have some new understanding of what faith is all about. Like, maybe you were leaning more into faith being an emotion or faith being kind of an intellectual agreement. And I'm just going to suggest that you need to move from your head to heart. That moving to a place where you see the vitality of a relationship with God, where you determine in your spirit to say, I want to trust the character, the covenant, and the commitment of my God. And it may be extremely strategic that you were just watching today. For others of you, you're tired, like you're weary. Maybe you faced some disillusionment. Some things didn't go well. Things got discouraging. You put your trust in God, at least the best you knew how, and then it just didn't pan out. And so you're a little, shell-shocked, shall we say? Like you're like a little hesitant. And I just want to say that sometimes making decisions about the nature of God when you're in the middle of a really hard season and drawing conclusions about who he is in the midst of that hardship is not the best time to make a determination about who God is. And so I'm going to invite you to take the risk yet again, that no matter what you're doing, where you are, what you're feeling, that you invite the Lord back into the cockpit and you say, this feels really risky to me right now. But allow him to say, and maybe even hear from him, would you let me take the yoke? Let me drive for a while. Trust me. I'm here for your good. I'm here for your healing. I'm here to restore your life. I know you have disappointment. I know you're tired. But come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. And that's his promise. And that's what's true. And my sense is that in the deepest parts of your soul, you know that too. And so give yourself permission, even as I get ready to close in prayer, to allow the Lord to be exactly that to you today. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, there is so much, as you well know, there's so much out in the world about faith and what it is and what it's not. And we can just get lost in the sauce of all the information. And I pray that somehow what we've talked about today and what faith is, what it's not, how we can build it by not putting our dependence on the variables, but finding ourselves focused on the constants, Lord, that all of that would lodge something fresh in our souls. That for those for whom this is absolutely new information, that they would be willing to take the risk and take the step to trust you. And for those who this is not new information, this is something they've heard before, but it's grown stale or it's grown like questionable because of circumstances, that you would bring them back to center and say, I'm here for you. Will you trust me? All the things that you've experienced, all the things that you've known in life, I'm going to use for good. Just trust me with this. And I would invite you, even in these moments, to go ahead and make it personal, to say something to God that feels authentic and real, and see if he won't meet you in this moment. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I hope you'll stick around if you're checking out North River Church. We'll have announcements here in a moment and a little tour of the facility in case you would like to come. But know that we are thinking about you and praying for you even before you come. God bless you, and thank you for watching.
Welcome to North River. My name's Christy Peck, and I'm the Next Generation Pastor here. And I would love to invite you to join us live and in person on Sunday mornings right here at North River at 9 or 11 a.m. for worship together. Let me give you a little tour. When you arrive, you're going to be greeted by a member of our connection team wearing one of these name tags. They can answer any of the questions that you have. Or you can feel free to stop by our Welcome Center, where we have more information and a welcome pack for you that has lots of goodies, as well as some information about the church for you. So make sure you stop in, say hello, and pick up a welcome pack. Now, if you are a parent of children ages infant through 5th grade, we also have a program just for them. It's called Kids Zone, and you can check your child in here at the Kids Zone desk. Now, if you're not quite ready to check your child in, or they're not quite ready just yet, that's no problem. Your child is welcome to join you in the service, or you can go to our family room where the service is live streamed just for you in case your little has a little bit of energy to get out. Let's take a look at our worship center. This is our worship center where Sunday morning services take place. Now, if you've just watched a message, then you know part of what happens in this room, but we invite you to experience all of it. On a Sunday morning, not only do you have the opportunity to get to know other people, but we also have a chance to gather and be led by our worship team and some music, to pray together and to experience the joy that there is in gathering together with lots of other people in the presence of God. We hope that if you are considering coming to North River, that you would know that you can come just as you are, and that if you have questions about faith, about God, about what church is all about, this is certainly the place for you, because questions are always welcome here as we journey on together to figure out what does it mean to live a life of faith. We hope to see you soon.